Hi, Jim Gossard here with John Richardson for another tax talk. Um, John, you wrote a fascinating article, you and Olivier, in the last day or two, and it struck me that that article does a lot to reinforce the importance of pure RBT, and that's a theme we've been focusing on with, I think, rightfully so, focusing on repeatedly as we do these podcasts. That really the solution to the tax problems for overseas Americans, it's just not possible when you look at the layers and layers of problems to fix this by fiddling with the tax code around the edges and creating an exception here and a rule there. That the root cause of this problem is citizenship-based taxation. And this dilemma that you and Olivier highlight in the article about what employees face that work in the travel industry, either in airlines or especially on cruise ships, and the tax jurisdictions they fall into when they are in international waters is really extraordinary. And it's just another example of this, the whole, massive problem that we're faced with as long as CBT is in place. But if you would please, why don't you explain what that issue is all about?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. We'll use the example of somebody working on first of all, number one, okay, we're talking about people who, although American citizens, do not live in the United States. They live in wherever, Mexico, they live in the Netherlands, and they're tax residents of those other countries. So for American citizens who are tax residents of other countries and earn income that's attributed to international waters, they're actually subject to double taxation on that. And the reason is, and we can go into the details, but the reason is that in order to, the usual vehicles to alleviate a double taxation, namely the foreign earned income exclusion or the foreign tax credit rules, apply only if there is foreign source income, meaning non-US source income. And the Internal Revenue Code in 863 specifically, if you can imagine, designates that income earned in international waters by any US citizen is sourced to the United States, thereby preventing the use of either the foreign earned income exclusion or the foreign tax credits to mitigate that double taxation. Think of that.
It's extraordinary. I mean, it's believable, John. That's maybe the scary thing about it. It's perfectly believable, but it's an extraordinary case. So let's say let's say you're an officer on a cruise ship or whatever. You're working on a cruise ship, and you fall into this category. What what happens to you? What is your tax obligation while you are in international waters? Your tax
Well,
obligation effectively your double tax is what it comes down to.
I mean, assuming that you are taxed on your worldwide income by your other country of tax residence, whether it's Mexico or Canada
Right?
or the Netherlands, whatever, they're going to want to tax that
They're going to want to tax you when you're in
worldwide
international
income,
waters.
right?
Of course.
And the U.S., well, you're a U.S. citizen. Doesn't matter if you don't live or have any connection with the U.S. We're going to tax you on your worldwide income, okay? But the U.S. goes a step further. And what the U.S. deliberately does in Section 863, by designating that income earned by U.S. citizens in international waters is U.S. source income, what it does is it precludes the ability to use the foreign tax paid to offset that. So it locks them in to double taxation.
Right. It's truly unbelievable. Now let's take it to one different angle. There's a lot of American pilots working for foreign carriers around the world. I thought about this myself as when I lived in Asia. It wasn't unusual for me to fly back and forth to the US 7 times. And if you do the math on that, I mean, every one-way trip is door to door, roughly 24 hours, roughly half of which is spent flying over international waters. I mean, theoretically, for me flying back to the US 7 trips a year, theoretically, I spent therefore 1 week per year flying over international waters. That's a considerable amount of time. What then is the situation that American pilots face? Let's say you're working for Korean Airlines, Cathay Pacific Airlines, any one of the number, and these are all there's hundreds, maybe thousands of American pilots in that situation.
Mhm. Well, the issue arises when they're flying over international waters. Okay, now, when I was researching this article, and full disclosure, I didn't know as much about this as I thought. Okay, until I started researching this, I must say it's been a bit of a eye opener for me as well. But one of the questions is what's meant by international waters, and as far as I can determine, the waters that would be 200 nautical miles from a country's coast should not be international waters, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, let's look at the situation, say an American pilot living abroad. Well, if they avoid international waters altogether, no problem, right? If they're just flying domestically, for example. But now let's look at, the issue of these flights across the oceans. Well, the first part of the flight would still be over. I mean, let's imagine that you fly from, say, London to New York, London, UK. The first part of that flight, presumably, you're still in UK territory, right? So for that part of it, there would be no issue. But the moment, and I frankly think that's important for everybody, given that the world is now run by tax codes. I think it's probably important for every airline to make an automatic announcement when the flight enters international waters. Because don't forget that a passenger who was working on a plane.
Who doesn't work on the plane now? Everybody does.
Exactly. The moment they enter international waters, they've got a double tax problem if they're an American abroad. So that should be a signal for all Americans abroad to turn off those laptops right there and make sure they're not caught working, right? Because
It could be a signal for them to put a movie on in the background so that they can pretend that they're not working.
as
when in fact
long as
they're-
it's not a movie that's related to their employment, okay?
Oh, yeah, right.
They'd want to watch The Wizard of Oz or Bambi or something like that, but nothing that's self-improvement, nothing that's educational. I mean, that could cause a huge problem. I mean, Americans are highly regulated people. Everything in the U.S. has a tax crunch. What'd you do last night? Watched a movie. Really? What movie?
Yeah.
But you think about this. So the moment that the pilot enters international waters, that's where the problems begin. Okay, and of course they don't really end because when you're flying to New York, at that point it is U.S. source, etc. Now, I don't know what the solution to this is. I mean, maybe pilots should, maybe major airlines should recalibrate their routes. They're always within 200 nautical miles of shore somewhere. Maybe they should sell a special class of service, special class of ticket called American class that will keep track on an annual basis of the exact number of hours that you were flying in international waters. Maybe it could be a perk with first class or business class or something like that.
Could be. Or if there were a diplomat on board, perhaps the entire plane could be designated sovereign American territory, and then the foreign income tax exclusion would,
Exactly. I mean,
something like that, John.
These are very serious problems created by that tax code. And
But the article that you linked to, and not the one you wrote, the one that I think CNN,
the CNN article about the pilot.
they wrote a testimonial of a pilot and what that pilot goes through to actually track this time. And it's an enormous, I mean, anybody, I'm sure a lot of people that watch this podcast find themselves tracking their travel. And it's one of the most tedious things you have to do is file a tax return. You got to know what countries you were in, how much time you spent in the US versus elsewhere. It's a tedious job. But the testimony of this pilot talking about what he had to do to track his whereabouts and just properly get his tax done. John, it's we've been highlighting this over and over again, but fiddling with the tax code around the edges, whether it's same country exemption or any one of these, so many other proposed tweaks to citizenship-based taxation, you're never going to capture all these crazy things that the tax code does. And really, as you keep referring to the importance of going to pure RBT, it really and truly is the only solution, isn't it?
Oh, Jim, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I didn't write that blog post or article specifically, to illustrate that point, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, it actually originated in a real world issue with somebody. Okay, but it does illustrate that point, right? Because if you look at, these proposals, which largely seem to focus around amendments to the foreign earned income exclusion, and this
Mhm.
sort of thing. And it's perfectly clear that, the whole purpose of the sourcing rules in Section 863D of the Internal Revenue Code is to source the income to the United States. So what good does it do, to muck around with the foreign earned income exclusion? But I would also make the point that this is an issue, interestingly, only for American citizens who are dual tax residents, meaning they don't live in the United States, right?
Yeah.
So it's one more absurd example of how the US imposes a more punitive kind of tax system on Americans abroad than on resident Americans. It's one more example of this. And, I have no doubt, by the way, that the compliance rate on this is obviously absurdly low, because who could even imagine that such a problem exists, right?
Yeah, and that's part of illustrating some of these things. Who could, if you tried, with an army
It's
of
impossible.
accountants?
It's impossible,
Yeah.
right? Impossible. Uh, and I would also, I suppose, add that, when I was reading, putting the blog post together, obviously I poked around to see what other people had written about this in any substantive way, and I couldn't find anything at all.
Hmm.
In terms of any, just sort of a passing comment, this is a problem. So, this is something that, your average person on the street would not know. I have no doubt that the specialists at the KPMGs of the world, are perfectly aware of this, and, advise their clients accordingly. But, who deals with that group? Well, actually, the point is that the people who deal with that group of people don't deal with their taxes. Their company deals with their taxes, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So it's not even an issue for them. But, on one level, it's comical. It's actually very sad, because it's another way of how, the US is destroying the value of US citizenship. But I think more objectively and relevantly, it's one more example of why the goal here, and the only thing that's going to work for all people, all time, under all circumstances, is to move to pure RBT, namely that citizenship cannot be used as the basis for tax residency ever. And this other stuff, which retains citizenship taxation, provides certain carve-outs, meaning, well, sure, you're a US tax resident, but we're gonna, let you slip away for this purpose at this time. It's not gonna work.
Raise the exclusion, same country exemption, that type of.
Oh,
There's a number of fixes, all well intended and all well thought out, and all would improve.
they're all well
They're
intended.
all intended to, and they would improve the plight of Americans abroad. But you're always left with this fundamental system that'll never work.
Well, it's sort of like, citizenship taxation is a cancer, and you can, play around on the edges, you can do some short-term surgery, but it's always waiting there, to erupt again. And this has got to come to an end. It has got to come to an end. And I guess my point is here that there is no way to solve this sort of, internally retaining citizenship taxation. The time has come for everybody affected by this, regardless of political affiliation, is to come together and say, this is wrong. This has to come to an end. This has nothing to do with revenue neutrality or anything else. This is simply wrong. well, we appreciate that citizenship taxation might be necessary, no, forget that. The rest of the world operates without it. The US can put a man on the moon. I bet you the US could figure out how to have a tax system that's based on pure residence-based taxation. What do you think, Jim?
John Richardson, as always, you're right on point. Couldn't agree more. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone,
Jim.
for watching. John Richardson, thank you so much.